So thank you everyone for joining the PatternFly-Next open demo. The purpose of this meeting is that we want to share everything that's going on as of late with the PatternFly-Next effort. So it's more of a deep dive on the things that have been going on. We are going to hold this bi-weekly. And it is open, so anyone can join. And if you cannot make this time, we're also going to be sending out the recording. One thing that we are also doing for this meeting is we want to hear from you. So feel free to ask questions. We also, if there's time, we'll have a question and answer after everyone's done demoing. But we also have put together a survey. So Sarah has put together the survey for us. She'll add the link to the chat. Feel free to open that up now. And if you want to go ahead and add your feedback as the meeting progresses, you can do that. If you want to do it later, you can do that. Just the important part is we do want to hear from you. So PatternFly-Next, the ideas behind it have been a long time coming. Andrés is going to dive in a little bit more on this specifically, but I just wanted to make you aware of a blog post that recently came out for the update of some of the things that we are trying to address with PatternFly-Next. And then I also wanted to just make you aware of how we are tracking everything. So I'm going to share my screen. So we have PatternFly GitHub, as you probably know. We do have a repo called PatternFly-Next. It will not be called that forever. At some point in time, we'll move this, but this is just a place that we are working for now. If you click on this repo and go to our issues, we not only are tracking everything in here, but we also have this concept of milestones that we're using within GitHub. If I do these alphabetically, we have a number of different milestones planned, and you can see with this there are target dates for that. So at this point in time, we are really early in the phase of building out PatternFly-Next, and we are currently trying to deliver on this first alpha. So this first alpha, the theme for this is just really foundational things of establishing, the CSS variables and really just putting down a foundation to build PatternFly-Next on. And that's a lot of what you'll be seeing in this demo. We have two other alphas after this planned we have started to. Alpha 2 is pretty concrete, but Alpha 3, we've started to populate that. And but as you get further along, you will see that there are target dates for things, but we still need to populate things. But this is a place that you can go to look and keep track of what is going on. So I will paste a link to this in the chat as well. And then I guess in addition to that, as I said, we will be having these bi-weeklies, and we also have a Slack channel. So if you want us to join us on that as well, we are available there. We have a packed demo, so I'm going to hand it off to Andrés. Do we have you, Andrés?
I'm here.
Okay. All right. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Let me share my screen. Yeah. So I'm going to keep you up to date to what we have been doing with CSS. Mainly, it's a change. I'm going to explain the PatternFly-Next architecture and what we have been doing so far. And the idea is that we are trying with PatternFly-Next to try to fix everything that we thought it was wrong with PatternFly-Free, mainly because we have been hearing people and their problems during these past 3 years with PatternFly. So as I'm showing PatternFly-Next to different people, for example, Matt Noldin from the Insights team that he's helping with PatternFly at the moment, he actually mentioned that this architecture is solving everything that was wrong with PatternFly-Free. And I don't know if we are solving anything right now because there isn't much at the moment. We are just starting, but we are aiming to do that. So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is, of course, Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, PatternFly is not based on Bootstrap anymore. And we are going to offer an opt-in PatternFly theme for Bootstrap for people that really wants to use Bootstrap. But my hope is that PatternFly-Next will have its own legs and people will not have to rely on Bootstrap anymore. So it's an opt-in, it's an option, and if people really wants to use Bootstrap, they can do it. And let me share this phrase from Kendall Totten. She mentions that Bootstrap, of course, has a place in the world, but whenever you have your own system, it's time to stop relying on Bootstrap training wheels and start building things on your own, right? And there are many reasons why we decided to take this step away from Bootstrap. And I'm going to share with you two of them. And the first one is because of this. PatternFly looks completely different now, and Kyle is going to give you an update of where the visual team is doing and how we are doing it. But you can just not have different styles assigned to the same class name without creating conflicts. So by using Bootstrap, we would be forcing our users to do an all or nothing migrations, which can be really challenging when you have heavily implementations of PatternFly. And also because of maintainability, for PatternFly-Next, our main goal is to make things maintainable over time. And by using Bootstrap, we are just tied together to Bootstrap release cycles and decisions. So PatternFly is a dependency. And as a dependency, we need to be solid and reliable over time. And from a CSS point of view, a truly maintained CSS means creating modular and independent UI structures, which means that we want to let each thing be a thing, right? When components are truly isolated, they don't have dependencies. So if we remove any component from the system, then the system doesn't collapse. And I'm going to show you how we do this. So let's first talk about HTML for a little bit. And as you know, HTML is the most important part of any system, not only because writing accessible and semantic HTML is critical for any UI, but also because here's where we create our API, our class names. So we have two types of UI structures. We have components and layouts. And then we put them together to generate use case specific entities that we call demos. So layouts are containers that allow organizing of its immediate children. So they define where those children are placed on the screen. And we have this syntax where we prefix everything with a PF, then we add an L to denotate that this is a layout, and then we give it a name, for example, gallery. Now, components are modular and independent structures. They are concerned of how the thing looks. And they always stretches to the size of its container. And to do that, they never have width, floats, or margins. And we prefix it with a PF for the whole system, and then a C for a component. And then the name of the component, in this case, a box. And we put them together into demos, which is where we show use case specific scenarios. Now for class names, we follow this convention where we have a PFC, then the block name, and then we separate it from the element with two underscores. And then we have a separated class for a modifier. And the idea is to create consistent modifiers across different components. And I guess the question now is when to create a new component and when to create a modifier. So we follow this idea of letting each thing be a thing. So a repetition is better than the wrong abstraction. So we only create modifiers when it changes state, scale, or color. So for example, if we have a box, if it will be PFC box. If it has PFC danger, is a change of color, it will make it red. If it's PF is small, it will be a change of scale, it will be smaller. And if it is PF is expanded, it's a change of state. Now, if there is any other change, like a different shaped box, then we are going to create another component and not following the same component name. So that turns out to be to have reusable components or reusable structures, where we have components that stretches out to the size of this container, and then their layout will regulate the placement and sizing on the screen, completely ignoring what they have inside. And it's really important that we never mix components and layouts in the same element. We always define the layout first, and then we put the components inside. And I'm going to show you things that we have been working on, which are a few layouts. We have some missing layouts still, and how we write these class names for components. So in here, I have the button components. If you see, it's PFC button, and then it has a modifier class of isPrimary, and that will make the button be blue, like this one here. We can also have something like isSmall or isLarge, and then they will make different sizes for the same entity. Now, for layouts, we define a few layouts at the moment. We have something called a bullseye that will place the element in the middle of the screen. It's like a model, for example, will use the bullseye layout. The gallery will generate galleries. So you can put whatever component inside this gallery, and it will take care of responsiveness and sizing on the screen. We have something called a level. The level will place its children into a level, the same level. Then a split is kind of the same component or the same layout as a media component, where you have a thing on the left, primary area, and then probably a thing on the right. And then a stack is the same as a split, but vertically instead of horizontally. We are developing also a grid layout, and this grid layout is only for scenarios like dashboards, and a page layout, which is a full page layout to accommodate this main navigation on the left, the header, and the main area. Now, let's talk a little bit about CSS. And one of the key aspects of the system is how we set up variables. So a successful variable system will allow designers or developers using the design system to create a themable and robust implementation at the same time. So we created this two-tier system with global variables and component variables. And Cliff and I actually wrote an article on CSS tricks. And before I forget, I just want to mention that Cliff has been working on all these layouts, and he has been a huge part of everything that you're seeing now today. So we did wrote an article for CSS tricks, and Jeff Graham, who was one of the reviewers and editors of the article, mentioned that this technique is making CSS more maintainable, and this makes me really happy because that was the goal of this variable system. So we have global variables, and they are the main goal of these global variables are to keep consistency across the different components, and they will also allow users to make global changes on their implementations. And they have this notation here, this syntax, that it looks complex, but it really isn't. So for example, here are 3 examples of global variables. So we have pf global to prefix any global variable. So we know it's a global variable and not a component one. And then spacer, for example, is a concept, and small is a modifier. Or font size is a property, and then small is a modifier as well as line height. So even though the syntax looks long, it actually isn't. Now, component variables are scoped to themable properties within the component. So everything that we consider themable will be open as a variable, which at this moment is anything that is not layout related. So, and the idea is that we know that users heavily modify PatternFly. So we want to open these windows to the code base without the need for them to change or to overwrite CSS. So they can change the variables and have a different implementation of PatternFly. And the important thing is that we always define component variables with global variables. So again, this has a very long syntax, but it actually isn't. And I'm going to show you like exactly this in code, and you will see that it's simpler. So for example, a box so the first part is just the class name or the selector, and the last part is a property. So we have PFC box is a selector, and then the color refers to the color of the box. So this allows users of PatternFly to theme it in a global manner or in a granular, and it has either global control or granular control over the components. So let's say a user wants to change globally the primary color of the system. So they will redefine primary color to be blue, and then they will have the whole system being blue instead of green. But let's say they want to have granular control over the primary color of the alert. So they will define the primary color of the alerts to be red, and then they will have the whole system being blue and the primary color of the alert being red. And as you can see, we are writing Sas variables. So we are writing Sas to preprocess our CSS, but we want to keep maintainability in mind. So as a rule, we are only using Sas for nesting and for variables. We try to keep functions, mixins, and other artifacts of Sas to a minimum when it's absolutely necessary. And even in those cases, we want to keep those mixins as simple as possible so we can understand them and maintain them over time. Now, we use Sas nesting to create class names, but not to increase specificity. So across the board, specificity doesn't get higher than 20. Most of the time is only 10. But we do use nesting for modifiers or elements of the block to write media queries and to define states, pseudo classes, and pseudo elements. And let me show you how these global variables and component variables works, and then how we write CSS with Sas. So here is the sheet, not the spreadsheet, the style sheet for global variables. We have this notation here, which is the same as I showed you before. And here is where we define all the colors. For example, the global background light color, which is going to be shared across the system. We also define shadows, spacers for margins and paddings, breakpoints, links, borders, and font treatment. And probably those are all the global variables we will ever need. And the good thing about this is that it creates bumpers for both designers and developers to work together. So on one side, we have designers, and Kyle will probably show you some of these, having these variables built into Sketch. So whenever they need to define a space, the only spacers that they have available is one of these 6 or 7 spaces we have here. There are actually 7. So the translation from visual design to code is seamless. They will just say, okay, here is a spacer. I use the medium spacer, so we use the medium spacer too. And then it creates a seamless translation between design and implementation. And the other thing that we have here is that is actually much easier to implement anything, because you don't have to think about like which value to place into any of the component properties, because everything is defined with the global variables. Now, on the component level, we are writing Sas, as I mentioned before, for nesting, in this case, states. So if we want to define a variable, we have, for example, the padding, right, or the font size. And then we have PFC bottom font size. So the name of the variable is PFC bottom dash dash and then font size. And the same for line height, for example. PFC bottom, I want to define the variable for line height. So I have PFC bottom and then the line height, right? Or the margin top, for example. And as I mentioned before, we always define these scoped variables of components with global variables. So for example, in here, the PFC bottom padding top will be defined by spacer extra small. And this will allow users of PatternFly to either make a change across the board by changing the spacer extra small. It will make everything consuming spacer extra small larger or smaller, depending on what they define. Or they can make a very specific change on the bottom to make it, for example, larger or smaller, the padding top of the bottom itself. Now, oops, there we go. Now, you're probably thinking, if you're using PatternFly, is how are we going to migrate from PatternFly free to PatternFly-Next? And I have good news for you is that we took care of that from a CSS point of view, that PatternFly free and PatternFly-Next can live together in the same code base without any conflict. So you can put a PatternFly-Next component within a PatternFly-Next component within a PatternFly free environment, and it will not leak any of the styles because there are namespace, and it will also not inherit anything from PatternFly free due to a CSS shield that I built that I can share with you if you want to see it later. Now, PatternFly-Next is a document-driven development, and that's the flow we used to have on PatternFly free. So if it's not documented, it just doesn't exist. So we want to treat everything in PatternFly-Next as if it was a liquid cat. So it must be responsive, accessible, and documented. And if it's not responsive, accessible, and documented, it will just not be merged into the code base. And the idea of all these rules is to generate this freedom, right? So this freedom of users to use PatternFly, but of course, if you're writing PatternFly, you need to follow the rules because this is what getting the system sane. Because a good design system empowers designers to code and developers to design. So here is you on the left, you are a designer or you are a developer. You want to create this UI, but in the middle, you need to write CSS, and that's something that can be tricky. So this design system with all the API, which are the class names, allows people to generate these UIs without having to actually write CSS. And the only way we can build this is by following closely all the guidelines. And also, the system, by following the guidelines, is ready to change. We know that things will change and evolve over time, and we can do it by following these guidelines. And that's something we used to, that wasn't such a big need before to have these strong guidelines because it was just a different reality, right? It was a smaller team and a smaller consumer base. Now PatternFly is being developed by a larger team and being consumed for more people, so it needs really strong guidelines. So that's everything I had to show you about PatternFly-Next CSS and we have been doing so far. I don't know if we have time for questions now, or Leslie, that's at the end. It's up to you.
Yeah, is there any questions? Remember, I put you on mute, so you might be talking. Okay, thank you.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name is Thomas. I was wondering, it looks really nice. I was wondering on the typography of it all, like, is there any relationships between those spacer values and line heights, font sizes? Is there some overall thing that's like hidden that I didn't see that binds it all together?
Yeah, so I know Leslie could have like 5 more minutes to show it.
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome. So I know, Thomas, we did talk about this on Slack, and I was going to ping you to give you feedback about that. So what I did, and actually like this is something we can evolve, but we have something called this here, BF spacer roots. So these define the root font size. So spacer are for spaces like margins and paddings, and then font size is for the font size, right? So these define the root size of the browser, assuming the browser has a 16 font size, but it doesn't have any unit. And then everything related to typography is based on that. So it's taking so to make like things easier with designers, we allow them to use pixels for their implementation, but we transform them to rem based on that 16 pixels or 16 value. And then for line heights, we just don't use units. That's the relationship between typography, basically.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned something about having responsive typography, and I would love to dig in more into that. So if you want, like after this call, ping me. We can set a meeting, probably with Kyle too, and talk about it.
Cool. Yeah, let's do that. Thanks.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, we're going to move along to the